So I'm just going to do an informal walkthrough of the Frank Jones, we call it, snare drum that I had custom made for me by Jeff Beck at Exeter Drum Works in Exeter, New Hampshire. So this is it right here, and just unbelievable. The story behind this, I'll just say really quickly, is I grew up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and grew up on property that in the late 1800s was actually owned by a man named Frank Jones, who was a wealthy businessman who was also into brewing beer, among other things. And he had these copper beech trees that were planted. He had them imported from Europe and planted on the property. And so when I grew up, we had one of those trees in our front yard, and used to enjoy climbing it, had a lot of really good memories of that tree. Very distinctive looking bark, which looks almost like an elephant skin. And so my parents unfortunately had to have that tree taken down 2 or 3 years back because it had a disease in it, and it was in danger of collapsing on the houses in that area, including my parents' house and also the neighbors. Trees was probably about 100 feet high, so very heavy, large, huge tree trunk sections. So they had to have that taken down, and at the time I was determined to save tree trunk sections, and came up with the idea of preserving that through a snare drum. So I had to dry the wood first, the tree trunk sections, which I saved, which were about 15 or 16 inches in diameter, about 6 to 8 inches deep. And I painted both sides of the tree trunk, the exposed wood area, with wood glue, which is something I read about on YouTube. It was basically trying to age it without having it crack. So that was going to take about a year to age that. So then I overcame that challenge a year later, and the tree trunks had dried out, and with definitely, unfortunately, some cracking. So then I had to find someone who was skilled at making drums in the area, and I really wasn't able to find any. The issue was the way I preserved or saved the type of wood sections that I kept were not long board sections, which I later learned were how you make snare drums is you bend long boards into the cylinder. And I couldn't save like 6 foot long tree trunk sections because they weighed like hundreds of thousands of pounds, the huge ones. So I saved the tree trunk sections, which I thought we could use. So I learned that we needed to create a type of snare drum called a block snare. And the way block snares work is they cut blocks out, and then they put them together into the cylinder, these block sections. This one has 20 blocks, and then glue them together, and then round out the outside and round out the inside. So I had to find someone who is skilled in making stave or block snare drum shells. I found a guy who was skilled in steam bent snares, but that wasn't something we were going to be able to do because of the wood sections. So luckily, a friend of mine who's a drummer, I don't know, a couple months ago, sent me this Facebook post about this guy, Jeff Beck, Exeter Drum Works. He just sent me a picture of one of the snare drums that he had made. And it was just unbelievable, like how nice this looked, this snare drum that he made. And I was like, wait a minute, I can see from that snare, that's a stave snare drum. This is the guy I need to talk to. So I reached out to Jeff. He immediately got back to me, went to his drum facility where he makes the drums, and brought the tree trunk sections, all 3 of them. And Jeff, agreed to take on the project. Took him about a month, I believe about 60 hours of labor, which is, he said, about 3 times longer than a normal snare drum would take him. The reason being that partially the cracking, but the other reason was he decided to use the heartwood. So instead of cutting the outer parts of the tree trunk that maybe had less personality to the wood grain, he chose the center section of the heart of the drum due to a different density and a lower fundamental tone to get a really beefy, kind of an awesome lower tone, bassy tone snare drum, and also the personality of the wood grain. And I learned throughout the process of him sending me videos that how much more difficult it was for him to do it that way, because of a lot of different things. The bottom line is what he did was amazing, and you can see the personality of the wood grain is just really incredible. This is the section of the diseased part of the tree that he intentionally saved. Almost looks like it has faces in it if you look up really close. Really beautiful stuff. And then what ended up being my most favorite feature of this is something that's done on very high-end artisan vintage furniture and tables, is they'll actually take a section of the wood and they'll create this see-through section here, which flows down almost like a river. And this is clear. This is made of epoxy, I believe, or resin that Jeff did. So he intentionally created this stave so that you can see through it and you can actually see inside, preserved the inside of the wood grain. You can see right through this if you shine light through it. But then in low light, it just looks like a normal feature of the wood. So just unbelievable craftsmanship. You can see all around this on the inside of the shell. And he put special bearing edges on this which curve inward to create a more warm sound. You can really see it here. You can actually see the edge, the bearing edge of the drum here, and there's this space. And the head just sits perfectly on it, the drum head, when you're tuning it. It just resonates so freely. We did these tube lugs, which are really awesome. I think they're titanium. And we chose that. It's a 6-inch deep by 14 inches in diameter snare. I picked everything out custom. Jeff had me pick, you know, like I went with the Remo Ambassador coated on the top and the clear on the bottom, Canopus vintage snare wires, and then an Indie snare throw off, which is really cool and solid, just feels amazing. And bottom line is, when I got this snare drum back, I was blown away by the sound. Like, I've owned probably 2 or 3 dozen snares, and I've always tried to get that perfect sound. I've owned, you know, $1,000 snare drums. Never found that sound I was looking for. And with this, I wasn't expecting it to sound great because it was just the wood that I was working with to give him to preserve it. I didn't think that it was going to sound so amazing. It's the punchiest, most perfect sounding snare. It's got this deep tone to it. It's super resonant. It's exactly the opposite of the way we thought it was going to sound. We thought it was going to sound high-pitched and short and just project well, but it just sounds, it projects well, it sounds punchy, deep. When you tune this thing up high, it still sounds bassy and deep. It's like nothing I've ever played, and it just sounds amazing. So thanks to Jeff Beck at Exeter Drum Works for taking on this project. Here's his custom logo here, made out of a special kind of wood, and it has an X on it for Exeter. I think it's the X Factor, because it has the X Factor for me in terms of the sound. And that's it. I hope everyone can check out the interview with Jeff on New Hampshire Chronicle coming out this month. Thanks a lot.